When people talk about the person Ken Curtis quietly struggled with the most during his years on Gunsmoke, one name always rises to the surface: James Arness. It still surprises fans because on screen they seemed inseparable, the perfect Western duo: Marshall Dillon, stoic and immovable, and Festus, scrappy, loyal, and unexpectedly wise. But behind the walls of CBS Television City, the atmosphere was far less friendly. When Ken Curtis arrived in 1964, stepping onto stage 3 for his first Gunsmoke episode, he walked into a world Arness had ruled with absolute authority for almost a decade. Everyone on that set knew the unspoken rules. Arness set the tone, Arness decided the pace, and most importantly, Arness controlled the frame. He chose where people stood, how scenes opened, and who got the camera's attention. At first, Ken didn't fight it. He admired Arness, respected his experience, and understood he was joining a machine already in motion. But around 1967, something shifted, something Arness felt before he ever said a word about it. Festus started pulling reactions no one predicted. CBS mailbags filled with letters from fans demanding more Festus episodes, more Festus banter, more Festus heart. Viewers connected with the character in a way that threatened the careful balance of power that had existed for years. Festus wasn't meant to be the soul of the show, but audiences treated him like he was. And for the first time, Arness wasn't the center of every conversation happening around Gunsmoke. Crew members noticed the tension almost immediately. Moments that should have been light rehearsals, blocking sessions, read-throughs suddenly felt heavy. Arness would quietly shift marks on the floor, subtly moving Ken farther from the camera. Directors were gently reminded to keep Dillon strong in the frame. Even jokes between takes became sharper, edged with a competitiveness neither man wanted to acknowledge. Ken felt it, the slow tightening of invisible boundaries. And though he never confronted Arness publicly, those early cracks grew into a quiet war of ego, pride, and control, one that lasted for years and left scars both men carried long after the cameras stopped rolling. That was exactly when the first cracks truly appeared. Crew members would recall small but telling moments during blocking sessions, moments that stuck with them for decades. Ken's jokes, usually harmless, started stealing the room's attention. The grips laughed, the makeup team chuckled, even the extras leaned in. But Arness didn't smile. Not once. One rainy Tuesday in early 1969, a miserable, cold, gray day, as one camera assistant described it, Arness quietly stepped off his mark, pulled the director aside, and suggested trimming some of Festus' lines because the pacing felt slow. It was subtle, said softly, disguised as creative concern. But when word reached Ken before lunchtime, it landed like a punch. That small note carried a much heavier message: stay in your place. Don't get too big. Don't forget whose world this is. Another moment stung even worse. During season 15, a rare script gave Festus the emotional closing beat of an episode, a quiet, heartfelt moment that would have shown a new side of him. Crew members were excited for Ken. It felt like a step forward, a sign the writers finally wanted to explore Festus beyond comic relief. But the next morning, the script returned with overnight rewrites. The final moment belonged to Matt Dillon again. No one needed to ask who had the power to make that call. Ken didn't argue. He wasn't confrontational, and he wasn't interested in political games. But inside, the resentment simmered, slow, silent, corrosive. Fans saw two men who looked like brothers. Number 2, Amanda Blake. The quiet war inside the long branch of Ken's tension with Arness was subtle. His conflict with Amanda Blake was anything but. It didn't simmer. It sparked, fast, bright, and loud enough for the whole set to feel it. The moment Festus began stealing laughs in the late 1960s, Amanda sensed the shift immediately. And unlike Arness, she didn't hide her frustration behind professional calm. Cast members still talk about the first real blow-up in 1968, right outside the Long Branch set. Amanda tossed her script onto a chair so hard it slapped against the leather, then muttered, "They're turning this whole thing into a circus." No one had to ask who they meant. Amanda Blake had been the beating heart of Gunsmoke since 1955, the leading woman who survived cast replacements, producer overhauls, and network meddling. She had seen countless actors come and go, but she stayed. She knew the rhythms of the show better than anyone. And then Festus walked onto the set with his scruffy beard, gravel-soaked voice, mismatched clothes, and scene-stealing energy. Audiences adored him instantly, as if he had been part of Dodge City since day one.
For Amanda, that sudden shift wasn't just surprising, it felt like a threat.
The Long Branch was her kingdom, and Festus had wandered into it with a charm she couldn't control. That sudden burst of popularity bruised Amanda's pride more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. One afternoon during season 14, as she slipped into one of Kitty Russell's iconic gowns, she vented to a wardrobe assistant in a low, sharp voice, "I worked 13 years for this spot."
He walks in and gets handed half the show.
That sentence spread across stage 3 faster than spilled coffee, whispered among grips, camera operators, and makeup techs until, inevitably, Ken heard it the very next day.
He didn't confront her. He didn't joke about it.
But he carried the sting in silence, filing it away with all the other quiet wounds the set had handed him. Their most uncomfortable clash came during a Gunsmoke promotional shoot in early 1970. The photographer arranged a playful composition with Festus and Kitty standing together at the center, something light, something fun for CBS marketing.
Amanda walked over, studied the layout sheet for 3 seconds, and snapped, "Festus doesn't belong at the center of anything."
The room froze. You could have heard dust settle. Ken looked at her, swallowed his embarrassment, and stepped backward out of frame without a single word.
That was the turning point.
After that day, he stopped trying to break the tension around her. No more jokes, no warm small talk, no attempts to smooth over the rough edges. Even during shooting weeks, the shift was obvious.
There were days Amanda refused to rehearse with him.
She would run lines with a stand-in, wait in her dressing room until cameras were set, deliver her scene with professional precision, then disappear before Ken had a chance to speak. The crew gave it a name, the Long Branch Freeze. And once it started, it never really thawed. By the time the 1970s rolled in, Amanda Blake had quietly become the second person Ken Curtis felt he could never fully forgive. Number 3, Milburn Stone. When two strong egos collided, what exactly pushed Ken Curtis and Milburn Stone, two men adored by fans, into their first real argument? And why did Doc Adams and Festus, despite their on-screen chemistry, end up barely speaking off camera? When you dig into the early production notes and behind-the-scenes memories from the Gunsmoke crew, one answer jumps out immediately: control. Both men wanted it. Both believed they deserved it. And neither was interested in backing down. Milburn Stone had been on the show since 1955. He wasn't just a cast member, he was part of the foundation of Gunsmoke. He had survived format changes, rivalries, pay negotiations, and endless script rewrites that favored other characters. By the late 1960s, Doc Adams was not just a role, it was Stone's identity, his creative anchor, his territory. And when Festus became a major presence, that territory suddenly felt smaller. He had earned his spot the hard way, and he guarded it with the kind of intensity only a veteran of nearly 2 decades on the same show could possess. By the time Ken arrived in 1964, Milburn Stone already felt protective, almost territorial, over Doc's position in the storyline. Festus, however, didn't arrive quietly. He didn't fade into the background and wait his turn. He arrived loud, unpredictable, instantly beloved. Fans adored him almost before they knew his name. That was the spark that lit everything, and the first real clash erupted in early 1966 during a script read-through. Writers had given Festus several comedic punchlines while Doc's role in the episode remained understated, almost muted. Halfway through the session, Milburn snapped his script shut, leaned forward, and said sharply, "Why is the deputy playing comedian when I'm standing right here?" The room froze. A few nervous laughs scattered across the table, but no one dared respond. Ken didn't laugh. He didn't look up. Things only grew heavier in the following year. One particular moment is still remembered by an assistant director. Stage 3, late afternoon, the air thick under burning studio lights after a long day. In the middle of a scene, Milburn stopped abruptly, broke character, and walked toward the director. "Rewrite that," he insisted. Doc would never let Festus out-talk him. Ken heard every word. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. But the moment the director called cut, Ken walked off the set without making eye contact with anyone. By 1969, the friction wasn't explosive anymore, it had settled into a routine. A silent, strategic duel. If Festus had a strong emotional beat in his script, Milburn pushed for more Doc dialogue to balance the scene. If Doc received a spotlight moment, Ken responded the next day with subtle improvisation and extra mutter, a well-timed look, a small comedic beat to keep Festus just as memorable. The crew began calling it the Dodge City tug-of-war, half joking, half resigned. One showdown in late 1969 said it all. A script originally ended with Festus delivering a rare tender moment, unexpected, heartfelt. But the next morning, the revised pages came in. The ending belonged to Doc again. No one announced the change, but when Ken flipped through the rewrite packet, his expression hardened. No shouting, no confrontation, just that look, tight and silent, that told the whole story. By the mid-1970s, they had perfected the art of working together professionally. Their timing was seamless, their scenes smooth. But off-camera? The air between them stayed cool and sharp. They shared respect, but never friendship. Number 4, John Mantely, the man who pushed Ken Curtis too far. The person Ken Curtis clashed with the most over the years wasn't an actor at all. It was producer John Mantely, a man who believed discipline and hierarchy were the bones of Gunsmoke. And for Ken, everything with Mantely came down to two things, money and respect. Mantely took over major production control in the late 1960s, and from the moment he stepped behind the wheel, he ran Gunsmoke with a cold, corporate precision. To him, the show was a product first and a piece of art second. That philosophy never sat right with Ken. Festus had become the heartbeat of Dodge City, the humor, the humanity, the glue that held many late-season episodes together. Yet Mantely continued paying Ken as if Festus were just another background character who wandered into scenes and wandered out again. It felt like an insult disguised as a contract. The breaking point came in 1971. Ken finally walked into Mantely's office to ask for a raise that reflected the work he had been carrying for years. Mantely didn't just refuse, he dismissed him. And he did it in front of two assistant producers. According to one of them, Mantely leaned back, crossed his arms, and said, "Festus is replaceable. The show isn't." Those words were a knife. That was the moment when respect fractured into resentment. Ken wasn't asking for star treatment or special privileges. He was asking to be valued for the hundreds of episodes he'd poured himself into. And instead, he was told he didn't matter. After that, their tension spilled directly into creative control. Ken pushed hard for Festus to evolve. He wanted deeper backstory, more emotional range, storylines that showed who Festus was beneath the jokes and the scruff. The writers often sided with him. They saw the opportunity, the audience demand, the potential for richer stories. But every time the momentum started to build, Mantely shut it down. Too soft, he'd say. Too slow. Not where we want the show to go. One day in 1973, on Stage 5 during rehearsal, Ken discovered Mantely had completely cut a Festus-centered subplot without warning. It wasn't a minor scene. It was the emotional spine of the episode. Ken didn't yell, didn't argue. He simply took off his hat, slammed it onto a chair so hard the sound echoed across the stage, and walked out of the building. He didn't return until the next morning, and he didn't speak to Mantely for days. Years later, the wound reopened. In 1987, 6 years after Gunsmoke ended, CBS announced Return to Dodge, a reunion movie that the network wanted to anchor with familiar faces. Naturally, they wanted Festus. Fans expected it. The studio expected it. Ken expected at least a fair offer, but when Mantely reached out, he lowballed Ken so aggressively it felt like an insult, not a negotiation. Ken rejected the offer immediately, no counter, no discussion. And when the movie aired, audiences were stunned to see everyone return except Festus. Some believed it was a scheduling problem. Others thought Ken had retired. The truth was far simpler and far harsher. It was the final chapter of a feud that had lasted nearly 20 years. From that moment forward, Ken Curtis carried one certainty with him for the rest of his life. Of all the people he had ever worked beside, John Mantely was the one man he would never, could never forgive. Number 5, Dennis Weaver, The Shadow. Send the next section when you're ready, and I'll continue it in the same powerful style. Ken Curtis could never outrun one man, a man he barely even knew. You wouldn't think Ken had any reason to resent Dennis Weaver. Weaver left Gunsmoke before Ken ever set foot on Stage 3. They were never castmates. They never argued. They never exchanged a single harsh word. And truthfully, Ken didn't hate Dennis Weaver at all. He hated the shadow Weaver left behind. Chester Good wasn't just a character, he was a phenomenon. The limp, the soft-spoken drawl, the gentle humor. Dennis Weaver crafted a deputy who felt real, flawed, human. From 1955 to 1964, fans adored him. So when Weaver left to pursue new opportunities, he didn't walk away from a role, he walked away from a legend. And that legend lingered long after he was gone. Ken joined Gunsmoke just months later. But instead of being welcomed, he was measured every line, every gesture, every joke against a ghost he couldn't touch. The CBS mailroom proved it. Letters poured in during late 1964. Where's Chester? Bring back the real deputy. Who is this Festus guy? One fan wrote bluntly, Festus will never be Chester, no matter how hard he tries. Ken saw those letters. Someone in wardrobe accidentally left a stack on his chair. When he read them, he barely said a word for the rest of the night. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, an ache he didn't show. Then came 1966. Dennis Weaver was promoting Kentucky Jones and gave an interview. When a reporter asked about Gunsmoke, Weaver chuckled and said Chester was one of a kind. You don't just replace that. It wasn't an attack. Weaver wasn't thinking about Festus at all. But the quote spread through the Gunsmoke studio like wildfire. Ken heard it in the makeup trailer the next morning. According to the hairdresser working that shift, Ken went silent, completely silent, for the rest of the session. By 1968, the comparison became an invisible enemy. Every time Festus landed a funny line, someone whispered, Chester did it better. When Festus showed emotion, the murmurs came again, Chester was more heartfelt. Ken couldn't win. Not because he wasn't brilliant, but because he wasn't the man who came before him. And then came the twist, the painful, ironic truth: Dennis Weaver never intended harm. He wasn't a rival, wasn't jealous, wasn't angry. In fact, when he and Ken finally met briefly at a charity event in Los Angeles in 1974, the handshake was polite. Short. Awkward. Ken forced a smile, but deep down, the old sting still sat there like a stone, because the real resentment had nothing to do with Dennis Weaver. The MANIT came from the comparisons, the whispers, the shadow he never chose but never escaped. In the end, these were the 5 names Ken Curtis carried with him until his final days. But were these people truly enemies? Or were they just casualties of Hollywood's quiet, invisible war, where ego, pressure, money, audience expectations, and silent wounds collide in ways fans never see? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you want more hidden stories from TV's golden era, make sure to like this video and subscribe for the next deep dive.